They might think it's the editing that's the problem as to why they're not achieving that kind of finished, polished image that they're looking for. But actually, it could be something so simple as their aperture use in shooting isn't the thing that's giving them that narrative, story-filled image. But only at the point of actually having a conversation about it would it be obvious to them. Because like I said, I think a lot of us just fall into a habitual way of doing things. And I think just as much as we sit down and create like end-of-year blog posts, or we do our audits in terms of sales and income for the year and all that kind of stuff, we never kind of sit there and go, I'm going to sit and look at my images and just see what it is that's not quite working for me or what I want to improve on. So it's definitely the shooting side that's the first downfall.
The goal isn't to live forever. The goal is to create something that will.
Welcome to Perspective, a podcast for wedding creatives, where we sit down with special guests and talk about our many years of experience in the wedding industry so that you can learn from us and grow your wedding business. If you're a photographer who loves making beautiful images but struggles with your post-production, don't worry, because we're talking all about coloring on today's episode with Amy-Leigh Atkins. Amy runs the mentoring program over at Northern Presets Co. and helps photographers worldwide build custom Lightroom and Capture One presets and styles for their signature look. With a firm belief in giving help and support where needed and a constant awareness of people being disappointed with their editing, her mentoring program tackles every hurdle you can come across in editing. So let's see if this conversation can help you with yours. This episode is, of course, sponsored by With Jack, and now for a limited time by beans.ie. So, Greg, let me pass you the coffee, and you can tell everyone what we're drinking.
We are drinking the Harkin Coffee's Summer Blend. So, this is the second one that we've tried out of the latest delivery we've had.
Mm-hmm.
Summer Blend is Ethiopian, Nicaraguan, and Colombian. So, it's 50% Ethiopian.
Oh.
It says it's a real crowd pleaser. Big, sweet, with lots of fruit notes. It's versatile enough, can be brewed with any method. What did you brew on?
Just the Chemex.
Chemex.
Yep, nice and simple. That's kind of my preferred. Hang on. Oh, yes. That is good. But then at this point in the day where I've not had a coffee and it's my first cup, I always think the coffees are good.
Nice wee fruity note there. Yeah.
So yes, as photographers and filmmakers and business owners, we know the power of stories, and our sponsor does too. Beans.ie started because they knew there were so many stories about the world of coffee, and not just about the regions or the varieties, but about the people behind the beans, the roasters, and us, the drinkers. This is the most flexible coffee subscription that we've ever showcased. Oh no, my goodness, I'm butchering the sponsor now. I'll start again with that line. This is the most flexible coffee subscription that we've ever used, showcasing some of the top roasters around the world who bring something different to your table. You've been listening to Greg and I talk for years now about what we're drinking at our podcast table, and now you can join us. Curate your own monthly subscription with an ever-changing list of beautiful coffees, and because you are our besties, the Cinemate crew are hooking you up with an awesome promotional code. If you use promo code Perspective15, you can get 15% off your first order. That is promo code Perspective15. You can get 15% off your first order for coffees with stories sent straight to your door. Oh my goodness. Because that's live. That's terrible. God damn. Anyway, hello, Amy-Leigh. How are you? And what are you drinking?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on today.
Oh, pleasure.
I'm actually disappointed I don't have coffee right now. I've just got some simple water because I'm trying to get my water intake where it needs to be.
Yeah, I struggle with that as well, actually. I feel like if I don't start off with pouring myself a very big litre bottle of water, I just forget to drink throughout the day, which is terrible.
Carry your bottle around with you.
As Greg shakes his... honestly. But yeah, thank you for joining us. I think this is going to be a really good chat for people who, do struggle with their post-production. I know there are many of us out there. I'm trying to remember the first time I heard about you, Amy-Leigh, because it must have been, it was through Clubhouse, and I remember being called up by Neil Thomas Douglas because he was complimenting us on our colours, which is funny because I don't feel like they're anywhere near perfect, so that was nice. But yeah, you were talking, and like I said before the podcast, every time I listen to you, I feel like I am learning something completely new that just feels like, as a professional who, color grades or, works with images, works with video, that I should know this. And I know that many other people, should know these things as well. So, yes, but I have to apologize because the first time I heard you talk, I was like, oh my goodness, I love what you're saying. You have to come on the podcast. And then I forgot to message you back.
You did. You left me hanging.
I'm absolutely terrible. I am so sorry. And
shocking.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. Well, it's not funny. That is so rude. So again, I am so sorry. But I was at the time just kind of listening to Clubhouse. I didn't mean to engage, but I was cleaning the toilets at the time. Yeah, it was yeah. So sorry, but thank you very much for coming. I think it's gonna be just a really good chat, and I can't wait to hear more about your insights for color grading.
Awesome. Yeah. No, all is forgiven. And I'm glad to be here. I've been asked to do many of these things, and I always kind of shy away from it. But no, I'm excited to be on this podcast with you guys.
Yes, we're excited.
Apologies for Simon being so rude.
I can't say.
So obviously we're going to be talking about colouring in this episode. But how wide sort of does that go? Because we are filmmakers, some of our listeners are, but majority are mainly photographers. But can what we're going to talk about relate in the workflow terms to filmmakers as well? Yeah,
100%. Yeah, it's mainly about just image making process, whether that's moving images, still images. It's the same kind of process, and the same consideration needs to be given to both aspects for sure.
Okay. Because obviously, like, the content that we create is similar in a way, moving images and images, but, the file types are very different. How we approach color grading compared to that of like Lightroom or Capture One, very different. So it's kind of nice to hear that that's going to be
the theory behind
it is going to be the same.
Yeah, the theory behind it is exactly the same. It's just the mechanics and the process is what is different. But it doesn't just differ between moving image and still image. It differs between just styles of images in general, for what a light and airy videographer or still image maker photographer is going for is very different to the kind of earthy, moody vibes of a photographer or videographer. So the process to get to that end result is very different regardless of whether it's moving or still. It's just the mechanics and the process is different. But the colour theory and the kind of analysis that needs to be put into place and the control within that post-production is very similar.
Yeah. This is obviously this is a casual section of the podcast. So what have you been up to recently? Have you been shooting? Have you been up to anything behind the scenes on your business?
For me, guys, it's kind of all taken a little bit of a shift. So I'm doing a lot of writing for a professional photo magazine. And I'm doing a lot of working with software companies, testing their products. So, it's a shame. It's a shame that today is the day before a launch of a bit of software, which is tomorrow, and I can't talk about it. It's so gutting.
You cruel lady.
I know. It's an incredible bit of software. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But yeah, I'm just kind of doing that stuff, and it's totally different for me because I'm not a writer. I'm really bad at writing copy and all that kind of stuff. So it's been a bit of a different challenge, but it's good. So yeah, I've kind of diversified into that realm at the minute.
Mm. So what kind of stuff are you doing for the magazine? You said you're writing.
Yeah, so I'm basically the kind of quote unquote software expert or editing expert. All the different bits of software out there, I've kind of extensively tested them now, done reviews on them. Kind of tutorial stuff, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, and it's been actually mind-blowing. Some of the software I'd never even heard of myself, and some of the software is actually incredible. So it really kind of poses that question of, why is it that certain software like Lightroom is kind of industry standard, amongst us really. Yeah. Because there's some flaws with that, but then other bits of software does the stuff like 10 times better. Uh-huh. So it's obviously that comes down to mass marketing through Adobe, doesn't it? But yeah. It's been eye-opening and incredible. I've been recently looking into a lot of artificial intelligence in software as well, which is again mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah. What kind of software is that?
So we've got Portrait Pro, which most photographers will be aware of already. That's kind of where it does automation in skin smoothing, facial structure, all that kind of stuff. But then you've got bits of software like Skylum Luminar AI, which is completely AI based. And yeah, that's just mind blowing in itself because you put a bunch of raw files in there and it'll basically tell you how it thinks it should be edited based on different moods and styles and stuff. And so it essentially in one click, like loads, a whole bunch of images or a whole edit session could be done like in seconds. So it's quite frightening really.
Yeah.
I've seen quite a few people on YouTube they've obviously been given sort of early access or something, asked to talk about the product, Luminar, and it does look like it's got loads of potential to be something amazing in future. But right now, it seems like the edits are quite over the top. Yeah. I don't know whether that's just the way that people are using them in the videos.
Yeah.
But it looks like it's quite exaggerated editing.
Yeah, 100%. It kind of leans towards that kind of HDR vibe because they also introduced a bit of software called Aurora Hdr, so that's kind of where they come from.
Right.
All right. Okay.
So it all kind of has that look that looks a little bit over processed, but yeah, it's a whole new world, and just looking at all these bits of software is. Yeah, I mean, the options that we've got in the industry are just vast. And I think it's about just identifying what works for the individual photographer, One workflow, one bit of software is not going to suit everybody.
Yeah. How do you feel about software that, edits in one click?
I mean, like I said, it's both mind-blowing and scary at the same time, It definitely has, it has a market. And I think for say, a commercial photographer who doesn't necessarily have a signature style in terms of like their imagery, they kind of mold and fit the brief of their client, whether it's to fit that product that they're photographing or whatever, to fit the brand. Yeah. I think if you're that type of photographer, bits of software like Luminar is incredible, in terms of like speeding up your workflow, because essentially what that does is it reads the image and the tones in the image and then suggests a template, a way in which it thinks that image could be edited. And you can always come in and kind of control it or kind of reduce the amount that it wants to put on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does a very, very good job at kind of reading the image and sort of giving you a style to suit very well. Like I've tested it with lots of like kind of earthy vibes, like maybe coffee products or like hiking gear or whatever, and it kind of, it understands that that's the aesthetic. So it's really, really impressive. And I think for that photographer, in terms of like efficiency and time management, it's kind of like a no-brainer. But for all of the photographers that are kind of really, interested in the image making process and having a signature, editing style, and somebody who wants that kind of level of control, obviously it's not for any of those guys. So it's about the market, I guess. So there's definitely a place for it in the industry. I personally wouldn't use that, but yeah, it is incredible, and it does have a valid place, I think.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm just going to do a wee Q&A reminder, because I actually would love to hear people's thoughts on, like if you have a strong feeling towards any particular software, that you love it or you hate it. I would actually love to hear your thoughts during the Q&A section, which will be at the end of this podcast. Thank you very much to our Clubhouse listeners for joining us live. That is awesome. We appreciate your support. If you aren't a member of our Clubhouse room, you can go ahead and follow that. And if you're not a member of our Patreon page as well, you can get access to the Q&A section. If you're listening back to this audio as a podcast, you can go to our Patreon at patreon.com/perspective by Cinemate. And you can listen to our Clubhouse conversations, which is cool for people who are Android, because unfortunately you're still left out of this app. But yeah. Anyway, we are talking to Amy-Leigh, and I want to get to know Amy-Leigh a little bit better. So, Greg, hit that button.
Before I do that, I'm just going to say this coffee's getting better as it cools down. It's got that late Ethiopian fruity kick to it that comes in as it cools down even more. I'm enjoying it. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. Amy-Leigh, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, at the beginning of this recording, I did an introduction to you, but I always like to ask our guests to tell us themselves who they are and what they do. So, Amy-Leigh, who are you and what do you do?
Thanks, guys. I work with photographers all over the world, and it's a one-to-one service where I basically help them figure out their signature editing style. But it's not just about the editing style, it's about having structure in workflow, making sure that you're maximizing on efficiency and consistency. And also just really kind of pushing that photographer to think about things in terms of the shooting as well, because that obviously plays a role in the final image and what that looks like. So it's a kind of collaboration in a way, but I'm the preset maker, apparently. If you didn't already know.
Yeah, I love that. Who gave you that name, or did you self-bestow yourself with that title?
I think everybody else gives me that name.
Oh, that's awesome. So tell us how you got here. Like, talk to us about your journey.
So, you guys might be familiar with a worldwide community called Looks Like Film. Mm-hmm. So I was one of the original staff members on Looks Like Film, and I did all of the testing for the first set of presets that came out with those guys. So it was the Lauren and Chris presets, Don and Helen, and Ryan Longnecker presets. Mm-hmm. And I just kind of got into presets through that, really. I kind of I don't want to like mass diss the presets out there, but a lot of people really struggled getting on with those presets, even though they loved that kind of aesthetic. So I really kind of just identified that it was a struggle for many people, and just presets editing in general is kind of like a massive bugbear to a lot of photographers. So I kind of got a little bit just geeky and obsessive, really, kind of figuring out what presets out there were doing, really being surprised at some of the methods involved in some of the presets out there as well, and the fact that they could be sold mass market. And then some of my friends came to me and they was like, this isn't working for me. I said to them, just make your own preset. That's the only way it's really going to work for you, is just really sitting down, taking the time to figure it out, and building your own. And then they were like, well, can you not just do it for me? So of course I did.
Yeah.
And then those people liked those, and then they told some more people, and it just massively snowballed from there, where I was making presets for people. But I soon realized that regardless of how good the preset was that people were getting, how people were using the presets were maybe not in the most controlled way. So they were still struggling to get the end result that they were looking for.
Yeah.
So it's at that point that I created this whole program that I do, where we look at pretty much everything that plays a role in that final image, So from shooting, from culling, right the way through to actually editing. And now it's more of a well-rounded thing, where I'm not just Lightroom based. I'm working with lots of people that are interested in Capture One, and maybe people are still in that method of using Photoshop and Camera Raw, and for them, I'm like transferring them onto a different bit of a workflow that's going to just be more efficient for them. So it's kind of just like all things post-production, really, is kind of what I'm covering.
Yeah.
So yeah, that brings me to here.
Yeah. Do you have any photography work yourself? Is this... Did you come at it from a photographer's perspective, or
yeah,
no?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I'm a photographer. I mainly do elopements now in the Lake District. I only take a limited amount of bookings now, because this is more my thing. This keeps me busy enough. But yeah, absolutely. It was from that perspective. I've been through many years of trying to figure out my own editing style and what works for me. And I've experienced the frustrations that most people experience, I think, in post-production. So yeah, it's very much from that perspective as well.
Yeah. What are you saying you too yourself had a whole stack of presets that you sometimes or sometimes did not use on all of your images? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. All 50 of them, where I just kind of renamed them for that couple that I tweaked to. And then on the next wedding, I renamed it to that couple, and then number 2 or whatever. Yeah, I've been through all that.
Oh, man. Yeah. I feel like I'm there as well. Obviously, myself, not a photographer, or not a photographer in business. Obviously, I take photographs of family and stuff, but it is so funny because obviously I've got presets that I shove on, and I am getting to the point where I'm liking a certain number of looks, but then I'd go walking in a new location, and then suddenly the presets that I like the look of just don't work. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I think that's commonplace for most people.
Yeah.
And I think it's down to a number of factors as to why that is. I think everything from our mood at the time of editing right the way through to, sometimes stylized presets just don't respond in every scenario in the way that they should. So,
Yeah. So why do you think presets are so popular then? If they don't offer that sort of solution to every situation, is it a way for people just to make extra money? Why do the customers like to buy them?
I think it's down to just industry standard. I think lots of photographers just, when we get into the industry, we all kind of, seek out kind of business mentoring and, join groups and forums and kind of follow what everybody's doing. And presets are very much a part of that. I think people also tend to follow trends. So, at any given point, there's just a whole bunch of trendy presets that are kind of like the go-to, And I think people just feel the need to just get them, just in the same way that, they feel the need to have a camera kit. It's kind of completely essential to most photographers. And I think, especially when you're new, the idea of making your own presets just isn't a thing. I think people would much rather spend the time in their kind of branding or marketing or, going on portfolio builders or all of those other things kind of take priority. And the editing side of things just kind of gets put to one side. And they almost just want it to be the fastest, easiest thing possible. And I think preset definitely advertises itself as being that. But we all know the reality is very different. As soon as you bought them and installed them and you start using them, the reality is not that. The reality is very much that kind of cycle of frustration and self-doubt and that negative headspace, which is so commonplace with photographers, but it doesn't need to be the case, guys. It can be a nice world where it's frustration free.
What world are you talking about? What are you talking about? I should state that in no way are we criticizing other creatives for trying to make money, especially right now from selling presets. But I have to ask, do you think these presets are doing a disservice? Yeah,
I mean, I think I would never diss anybody that's selling presets out there. In fact, I'm working with 2 photographers who were my icons, and they're going to be selling those presets mass market. But the difference is sometimes you've got presets out there that are definitely just bad. I mean, they're just bad. There's no other way to put it. I mean, that's being polite. I think I'm trying to be not naughty with my voice. If anybody knows me, people know I'm a potty mouth. But anyway.
You can be naughty. It's fine. Be naughty. It's absolutely
we label
fine.
all these podcasts as explicit, so don't worry.
Okay, yeah. There's a lot of shit out there, but there's no regulation. And I think, there's also a lot of decent presets out there, some people come to me and they're like, I'm using this preset. And actually, for the most part, I really like it, but maybe it's just the skin tones that are out. And I'm more than happy to sit there and just get that skin tone where that person wants it and not really change anything else. But I think the disservice comes down to, I think everybody's work deserves a signature edit. And that doesn't need to be like the most stylized thing, but I think everybody shoots in slightly different ways. Everybody's looking and using light in different ways. So the way that we're kind of analyzing those aspects of image making is to a high level, but the editing needs to be the same level. We need to sit there and analyze exactly what we want to do with skin tone control or what we want to do with our color grading or, all of those things. But just going onto a website and buying a preset, it ultimately means that your work's going to look similar to everybody else who's bought that preset, and nobody wants that for their work. Surely not. I mean, that's where the disservice is, really. So we're not dissing any presets out there, but it's more a case of, let's give our work what it deserves, really.
Do you think there's like an appeal for photographers to feel like, yes, I'm now a part of the market that's like charging a good amount of money, so they buy the look, they put it on their work, and they feel better about themselves in that regard?
Yeah, I definitely think that's a factor for sure. But whether the end result is what it is through the use of that preset is a different question altogether. You know, I've seen work from photographers that are fairly new, and they've not actually bought any presets. You know, they've kind of gone at it on their own. In Lightroom, trying to make their own style or whatever. And actually, sometimes that puts them in a way better position than if they were to buy a preset out there. So although it is kind of a trendy thing and you do buy into, you know, oh, this photographer's iconic and the presets are available for sale, you know, I'm going to get them and stick it on my work and hope for the best. You know, the reality is very, very different because, you know, it's kind of stating the obvious, but one preset doesn't respond the same on everybody's work, you know. We're all shooting different. We're all using different cameras with different sensors that's recording colour different. So the colour is responding differently through that preset as well. So, you know, majority of the time when people are buying a preset that has been sold mass market, you know, often the reaction that they've got when they're using it is, my work doesn't look like all of those images that sold me this preset. And that's exactly why. So, yeah.
Yeah. Ultimately, what you're doing for people is you're designing something that saves photographers time and makes their work more consistent. And you've sort of touched on one or two of the benefits already, but what are the benefits of getting a custom-made preset compared to one of the mass market off-the-shelf ones?
The benefits, I would say, is really kind of analysing what you want to do with every single aspect of colour and contrast in your final work. But also, we look at how you're shooting and whether that is sort of giving you the end result that you're looking for. Because a lot of the time when I'm working with photographers, they'll tell me they want a certain style and the way that they're shooting is not going to help them achieve that style. So it's about kind of analysing how we're shooting, how we're using light, and whether that is informing that signature style as well. So it's a whole process where we look at shooting for consistency and for the end result that you're looking for, and then making that preset that's literally nailing every kind of control that you want in it. But then beyond that, you don't just use one preset. You know, you can't use one preset. We know that whenever anybody's bought a preset in the past, you kind of have to sit and faff throughout all different lighting scenarios to get it to work. So beyond that, we then create a whole set of presets that are made for different lighting scenarios and all that kind of stuff, just so the workflow is solid. And obviously, every time you're using those set presets, so whether it's your golden hour preset or your backlit preset or your indoors preset, every time that you're using that preset in those environments, you're getting a very consistent end result across your entire portfolio. So, yeah, the benefits are that it just ultimately is going to work for you and for how you shoot and for the end result that you're looking for, you know, and there's no compromises with any of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually really funny because obviously, and we'll get onto this a little bit more, but, you know, having talked to Emma Lawson, who's obviously one of your clients who you're working with, it's so interesting that you can shoot the wrong way in terms of color grading, which is quite interesting. I remember back when, you know, we were very, very new, and I learned, you know, how to become a kind of cool looking cinematographer, you know, with creating cinematic kind of shots. Yeah. And, you know, the big thing was like expose for the highlights. Even in the darkest rooms, expose for the highlights. And I've kind of kept that is kind of a look, and the look of our films is very much backlit, you know, unless obviously, you know, you can't backlit everything. Yeah. You know, the emotional content needs to be captured as well as the cinematic stuff. But yeah, it's so interesting to hear that you can shoot in other ways and that some ways don't work and some ways do work in different scenarios. I find that super interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And, I can work with photographers who are absolutely just nailing everything. You just mentioned Emma there, and she obviously won't mind us mentioning her. But yeah, I mean,
yes.
she's changed the way that she's shooting. Just because it gives her much cleaner results, some of the frustrations that she was experiencing in editing, where she knew how to control it to get a cleaner result in editing, whether it's grabbing the adjustment brush or whatever. But obviously all of that's really time consuming, and just changing up something small in the shooting side of things can massively save loads of time in editing and free up time so that you're thinking about stuff that's more useful in editing, I find it completely crazy that, for the most part, photographers view editing as, faffing with, white balance, the temperature slider, the tint slider, highlights, white shadows, blacks, and then go into the HSL bit to start faffing with, the oranges and whatever to get the skin tones right. Photographers view editing as that. But all of that should already be fixed and sorted within a decent preset. Editing should be much more about considering, what can you do to make that image the best image it can be? What tools do you need to have, if any? What are you going to do with cropping? Does it need cropping? Are you considering your composition and your use of light, all of those things kind of get put on the back burner because we're too busy faffing with just basic sliders for 10 minutes, so it's the other positive is that it gives you that mental shift, actually we stop thinking about all that stuff and start questioning other stuff that's going to really kind of maybe level up the work a little bit.
Oh, definitely. And we are going to get talking a little bit after our next sponsored ad about, working with presets and really shooting with your color in mind. But I want to just pivot ever so slightly. You mentioned Capture One and you mentioned Lightroom. And it reminds me of a conversation that I overheard you talk. I can't even remember what the room was, obviously. But you kind of dissed Lightroom a little bit. In fact, it wasn't even a little bit. It was so aggressively anti Lightroom. It was amazing. And it's so funny because obviously I use Lightroom. I know many other people use Lightroom.
Yeah, it's probably the most popular.
It is.
Talk about the differences between, say, Capture One and Lightroom. Because it just sounds absolutely crazy that this software that most people use is so flawed.
Yeah. We're going to have people from Adobe listening to this.
I know. Is this... Well, we like to have open and honest conversations on this podcast. So, go for it. Unleash.
I'm totally honest about this. I mean, everybody that I work with will have heard me say this. And I think before I get into what Lightroom isn't great at, let's just talk about the image making process in itself. So what we do is we buy the kit that we want to shoot, and then we take some images and then we need to process those files. And of course, Lightroom is the industry standard. It's what most of us are using. That's what I built this program around. And when we import our files into Lightroom or into any bit of software, any software that processes raw files, there is algorithms in place. So it's how that software is reading the information captured in that file and how it's processing that to then generate the image on screen. And the way that Lightroom's doing that isn't the best at all. Okay. So it actually, one of the things that Lightroom does bad is the fact that it decides on whether it wants to change the color balance of the image before we see it. So, and many people have experienced this, especially if you call in an external program, whether it's Photo Mechanic, Fast Raw Viewer, whatever it is. You know, you could be viewing your images in there. You could get really excited over an image and the kind of color tones in the raw file before you've even touched it. And then you bring it into Lightroom and you're like, oh, it kind of doesn't look the same, you know? That's exactly what I'm talking about. It is essentially processing the colour information in a specific way. And Lightroom doesn't do the best job of that, you know? Capture One is far superior where that's concerned. The way that it's reading that information and rendering that file is way better. You know, a lot of these softwares also have like built-in, you know, noise reduction, sharpening, whatever they deem as an important, necessary element to have in that processing. And again, Lightroom's falling down in those areas as well, whereas Capture One is really good with that. So yeah, just on that very basic, you know, that first import, the first time that we're going to see our images before editing it, you know, Lightroom isn't that great, and it's actually one of the worst because there's lots of other software that you can put your raw files into to start editing, you know, as the XO, which is a great bit of software and full suite editor, and they even do it better than Lightroom. So yeah, it's so we're falling down at the first hurdle with Adobe Lightroom, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's crazy to me because it is the industry standard. You think it would, you know, you think it would have standards on, you know, right at the start. How's it become so popular then? Is it just marketing? Is it just the big company putting the software out there, or?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is that, you know. Adobe are very, very good in lots of areas. You know, obviously there's no denying that the Photoshop is king when it comes to if we want to do anything extra, you know. So there's lots of things that they're pioneering with, you know. I'm not just going to sit here and diss Adobe. No. Not at all. But there's just definite, you know, things that they've completely just you know, kind of ignored and not given the full attention to. And a lot of it is around like color profiles as well, you know. Adobe want everybody to be using their color profiles and how they want color to look. So that does play a role, and although that's really good in some bits of software of theirs, not so much in others. So yeah, there's a whole world of stuff in terms of like, you know, image making and colouring within our images that most photographers aren't even really considering. You know, it absolutely blows my mind that photographers spend loads of money on kit. You know, let's get this camera that's amazing and it's got this sensor on it and whatever. But then ultimately, they don't even care about what software they're even putting that file through in that sort of final stage, or in the crucial stage of image making, really, because it's how we're utilising that information of what we've captured and getting the best results from that. I mean, the rabbit hole is really deep with this stuff. A lot of photographers would just be like, you know, I don't know what you're on about. Like everything in Lightroom just looks fairly all right to me, and I get fairly decent results or whatever. And that's great for a lot of people. If that's the case, then there's no issue, is there? If you're happy with your work, then that's fine. But the reality for many is that there's lots of things that just don't respond in the way that photographers want them to. You know, they really struggle getting a control over colour or what the file looks like, or, you know, any of those things. And there's lots of these little factors that play directly into that frustration, you know. So
and look, like as filmmakers, like, you know, we use Premiere Pro. That still has its issues. Like when we export a file, the colors completely change. They desaturate. All sorts of stuff happens to the image, and you're just like, this is not like you spend all this time color grading, and then it's not how it is when it comes out at the other end, and it's really annoying. And you know, you have to use like an export LUT, but still that that's not precise enough for me, and I'm never happy when I use it. So even, you know, Premiere Pro, and I feel like I am bashing Adobe because I you know,
but we use it, and
yeah,
it's the thing we're quickest at using, but it's not optimized for Mac. It's got all these flaws, like you need to gamma correct on export and everything.
Yeah, but
we still use it because it does have good points that work the way we like to work. So
yeah,
it's just the same in both in photography and filmmaking.
And I'm gonna make so many people cringe when I say this, but I actually edit the podcast on Premiere Pro. I should use Audition, but I don't. So I know.
Yeah. How can people get the most out of their editing platform, whether it is Capture One or Lightroom?
We just need to really kind of strip it back and understand the every single step in image making, you know, and analyze it at every single point, because, you know, let's just talk about the most common issue that's been so massive in recent years. Everybody's jumped ship to Sony. So a lot of Canon users went to Sony and then absolutely shit themselves when it comes to editing. They just could not edit anymore. The trusty preset that they used for many years just didn't look anything remotely similar on the Sony files. And that's down to how the sensors record in colour initially is vastly different across cameras. So, you know, a lot of that's actually kept me really busy in recent years. So thanks for that big Sony boom. Everybody panicked and came to me and was like, you know, holy shit, I can't edit anymore. Can you help? And I was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people have kind of experienced that. And then like on photography groups, you'll find that you know, people who maybe have shot Nikon went to Sony, and those guys are like, I haven't seen any difference. Well, Sony make Nikon sensors, so we've got the same colouring going on across those. So of course we're not going to see any difference, but the Canon versus Sony or Nikon sensors are mega different.
Yeah.
And, you know, across the industry, it's commonplace that a lot of photographers might have second shooters, you know, so you might have a Sony kit, but the second shooter that you really love the work of, or that you trust working with, might be a Canon shooter.
Yeah.
When it comes to editing those files in one big chunk, I mean, that's just a recipe for a disaster unless we understand what the differences actually are. And once we understand what the differences are and we put the control in place, it becomes mega easy. So it's about really kind of, you know, analysing every single point. You know, what are we shooting? How's it capturing colour? How are we using light? What are we then doing in editing? What's the software doing for us? Is it doing anything negative that might throw us off base? Because it absolutely does in Lightroom, as I just mentioned. You know, and understanding that as well. You know, and there's a lot of bugs as well with Lightroom, which I just find mind-blowing. You know, all of us in this room are potentially paying for that monthly subscription. Yeah. So, I mean, it's insane that there would just be consistent bugs. I mean, you know, there's a massive one at the minute. I don't know if anybody's experienced it, but on export, if you put any grain on your images in Lightroom, on export, that grain's going to be like 10, 20 times as much as you thought it was.
Oh my God.
And you're just like, I mean, how are you meant to control that? How are you meant to understand what it's going to do on export? I mean, and you end up sitting there trying to guess. It's mainly guesswork. You're like, okay, so I'll just put 2% grain in and hope for the best on export. You know, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff.
It's actually really funny because at this point, if you're a filmmaker and you use Premiere Pro, it's kind of a meme at the moment, like that you just should not be using it because it has so many bugs, which I find really hilarious. That, you know, it's been this way for years. It's so bizarre.
And we kind of just accept it, don't we? We're like, well, what else are we going to use? What else? You know, we only understand our workflow within these bits of software. But I think the whole market's going to change with that, you know. Lots of people are asking me about Capture One and switching to Capture One, and I'm a massive advocate for Capture One, so I'm all about that at the minute. I'm like, yes, let's all go to Capture One. But you did ask me before about the differences, and I mentioned about that first import and the differences there, but there's lots of other differences, you know. We just had a joke there about the grain bug at the minute in Lightroom. So grain and sharpening and you know, these tools that are essential for us, they're just so unresponsive in Lightroom, or they're buggy as hell. Whereas in Capture One, the responsiveness of it is just, you know, exactly what you expect. And you can visibly see as well on screen what you're going to get in that end result, whether it's on the client gallery or whether it's, you know, what you've sent to the lab for printing. So you've got a real... it's more refined, and you've got way better control over the essential stuff as well as all of the extra stuff that it does great as well. So yeah, no brainer for me.
Yeah. Clubhouse listeners, thank you very much for joining us. This is just a Q&A reminder. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the podcast, so you can ask Amy-Leigh anything you want. But yeah, if you're listening, if you're not listening on Clubhouse and you aren't a member of our Patreon, you are leaving some amazing content on the table, because the Q&A section, if you didn't catch it live, is only available on our Patreon. So patreon.com/perspective by Cinemate if you want to listen back to the Q&A section. However, Greg, let's listen to Ashley Baxter.
With Jack was designed from the ground up and is tailored specifically for creatives. Whether you provide a service like design, development or photography, or offer advice to clients, With Jack is for you. It's focused on creatives. Insurance shouldn't be complicated, so With Jack has made every step easy. You'll deal with one form and talk to one Jack as you sign up, get covered, and move on with your day. With Jack is all about bespoke insurance for creatives. Simple. That doesn't mean more forms or faff, it means less. It's not about endless features and stale service. It's about one solid policy and the personal touch. Bye-bye unnecessary fuss. Hello, creative friendly insurance. Be a confident creative.
So I should say, I should say before we continue that I did actually work with Emma Lawson to create some of these notes in the post-production of this episode. So she has given us permission to talk about, you know, her work, and so yes, thank you, Emma. But those reds, am I right, Amy-Leigh? Oh.
The reds.
Oh man! Oh, I burst out laughing so hard when you were ripping into her reds.
Yeah, I mean, there was nothing else to rip into. Let's be honest, her work is incredible.
I know.
But I was like, those reds need to go.
Yeah.
Like, and we've done it. I mean, it looks incredible now. But yeah.
Well, obviously, knowing I was going to speak to you, I had to ask Emma for help, just because, you know, I can imagine the synergy between you would have to be quite high to work on, you know, presets, especially when you represent someone else's brand. But I did find it really interesting, and I touched on this earlier, that she said that it's made her see, as an established photographer, things that she wouldn't have seen without having you worked on her presets, which I thought was kind of incredible. So what should people look for in terms of how we shoot when we think about coloring? You know, how can we shoot better with color in mind? So
it is entirely style dependent, which I'm sure that is stating the obvious, really, isn't it? But, you know, obviously the way that a photographer in kind of like the moodier, earthy style is going to shoot is entirely the opposite of somebody who's, you know, light and airy. And it's about understanding your camera and metering modes and whether that is working in the way that you as a photographer is chasing light, you know. And there has to be a synergy between those things. And you have to understand that, and really make decisions on every single point of that. You've got to make a decision as well as a photographer when you're shooting. How are you shooting in terms of exposure? If you're shooting underexposed, what does that mean then to your shadows and the colours in shadows? And what I mean by that is colours in shadows are often more saturated. So how are we going to then, tackle that afterwards in the preset? Mm-hmm. So all of those things really play factors, and it's kind of like, I always view this, the best way I can describe it is it's a little bit like cooking. You have your shopping list, you go to a supermarket, you buy your ingredients, and then you've got to put those together in a specific way, but then we know that there's like hundreds of recipes to create the same dish, but all of them are going to have like little different nuances to them. It's exactly the same when it comes to image making and the shooting versus editing process, So you've got to really think about that side of things. And that's why in this program that I run, we do put a massive emphasis on shooting and what are we doing there. And it's not only about like shooting for colour. It's about creating your signature shooting style, just as much as we're going to sit there and figure out what your signature editing style is. We need to understand what our signature shooting style is. If I said to everybody in this room, describe to me what your signature shooting style is through your use of aperture, what would be the answer? Would most photographers say, I shoot f2.8 or wider all day until we get to group shots, and then I up it a little bit, and then I go back to 2.8 or wider all day?
Guilty.
Yeah. And if that is the answer, is that a considered thing? Or is that something that you've fallen into because everybody else is doing that, Mm-hmm. And so we literally it's about questioning things. I think there's a lot of things that until we ask a question, we don't necessarily sit there and think, I'm actively doing it this way because that's the way I choose to do it for this reason. I think a lot of the time we just kind of fall into habitual methods of doing stuff. And I'm definitely guilty of that. Before I was a wedding and elopement photographer, I shot a lot in Africa for charities. And when I was walking around Africa with my kit, I wasn't shooting everything 2.8 or wider, put it that way. But as soon as I became a wedding or elopement photographer, that's exactly what I did. Now, whether that's because we think of like the professional image, quote unquote, as having the blurry background with the bokeh, and we've got paying clients for that. Does that play a role in why we all do that? I'm not sure, But it's about really questioning every single thing that we do in both the shooting and the editing side of things, just as much as we do with, we sit there and we kind of go on courses to figure out our branding and go through big processes to nail that side of things. But the editing and the shooting side of things for many photographers is kind of just like almost like, and many photographers won't mind me saying this, but we're kind of just winging it a lot of the time. And actually that's the products that we're selling,
Yeah.
So it's
So winging it, they get to a certain level and then it's successful and they think, okay, I'm good actually, but they've not went into the nitty gritty of the details. But in terms of taking control of your editing, I'm going to say, where do you think most photographers go wrong? But I don't mean they're going wrong. I just mean like, where are they sort of letting slip, I guess? Is it not thinking about the edit when they're shooting, like what you're saying? Or is it those white balance and exposure sliders, they're wasting too much time there?
Yeah, I would say definitely in the shooting side of things, it's where that's the first step. It kind of goes wrong for a lot of photographers. But in saying that, I've worked with lots of photographers that are really good shooters. They've got everything that they could dream of in terms of like the raw file. And then they just overthink it then in the editing process and maybe go too far with the editing. because they feel like they maybe need to. So there's lots of different aspects, but definitely the shooting side of things is where most photographers kind of go wrong. It's I get many photographers coming to me for that kind of cinematic look, and they're just not utilising light in the same way. Or on the flip side of that, I get lots of photographers that are very much kind of just middle of the road, kind of very clean, timeless kind of style, who pride themselves on being like fully documentary, all about taking that narrative-filled image and those action shots, all that kind of stuff. And they come to me for custom presets, and I always get people to fill out a form, and it's super awkward. People hate it. It's not the easiest form to fill out, but I do it like that for a reason. It's because it's to get people to start thinking about these things in terms of like what they want to do with exposure, what they want to do with skin tone control. All those kind of questions are in the form, basically. But one of them is, what are the photographers that you like the editing style of? And a lot of documentary photographers will come through and they'll name like icons, people like Andrew Billington or Two Man as like, their go-to. Obviously kings, queens of documentary action shots. Yep. And then I'll be looking at the files afterwards and I'm like, so you've not sent me one raw file that's above 2.8. So where's the story across the frame here? Like what, if you look at Andrew's work, we're definitely shooting up at the F8, F11 for a lot of them. So where are those? And for some, they might think it's the editing that's the problem as to why they're not achieving that kind of finished, polished image that they're looking for. But actually, it could be something so simple as their aperture use in shooting isn't the thing that's giving them that narrative, story-filled image. But only at the point of actually having a conversation about it would it be, obvious to them. Because like I said, I think a lot of us just fall into a habitual way of doing things. And I think just as much as we sit down and create like end of year blog posts, or we do our audits in terms of sales and income for the year and all that kind of stuff, we never kind of sit there and go, I'm going to sit and look at my images and just see what it is that's not quite working for me or what I want to improve on, So it's definitely the shooting side that's the first downfall.
Yeah. Do you think when talking about like, I don't want to stereotype, I'm assuming that most photographers shoot prime lenses, and the reason you'd probably shoot prime lenses is probably because that those prime lenses have a lower aperture. So do you think, again, not that the market says this, but in most cases, the wider the aperture, that lower number comes with a price tag. So when they invest in a lens that is like a 1.2, even though that's crazy wide, do you think they feel more enticed to shoot to try and not recuperate some of the cost of the lens, but do you know what I'm trying to say here? Yeah.
That's what those lenses do best, isn't it? So, of course, if you buy it and you're investing in kit that does that, then you're going to want to maximize on that. But does that mean that every single image you take afterwards is completely, maximizing on that bokeh and separation between subject and background? And is that a signature style that you've got that's intrinsic to your work? Because for some photographers, it doesn't mean that, and also, I'm really interested in how the viewer views images. So, like, part of my background is I did a master's in philosophy of visual culture and how people read images and art. It was completely irrelevant.
Oh, really?
It was a bit of a waste of time, but I found it completely interesting.
Yeah.
My dream was to like own a gallery and be a curator and talk loads of pretentious shit about art for days on end. But anyway, that didn't happen. But it is interesting. It's totally relevant to what we do, in terms of like, did we deliver to the client? And it's interesting when you've got, just let's just pause on that for a second. The mad concept of a client pays loads of money for images that capture the best day of their life, and yet we go and deliver those images in a gallery grid. So they just view it as like, you know, thumbnails, and we can choose big thumbnails if we want, but essentially it's just a grid of images that are quite small. I mean, that in itself, just verbalizing it, is the craziest concept. But anyway, that's just the way it is now. That's how we're delivering to client.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about that is when you as the viewer, when you are looking through a set of images, if all of them are the same, so say, for example, shot 2.8 wider, we've got the bokeh in every image, yeah? What happens is the viewer then automatically fills in that the next row of images and the next row of images as they're scrolling through automatically has a blurry background. So all they're looking at is subject matter and moment, but they're looking in a very passive way because they've already kind of half filled in the image. So they're not looking at the full image in its entirety, how you've crafted it and how you've sat there editing it. It's all lost, you know, it's just about subject and moment. Whereas if you change it up a little bit, where it can't be predictable. So say, for example, you take, you know, a whole bunch of shots in the way that, you know, we're maximizing on the separation between subject and background, where it makes sense to do that. And then we've got a whole bunch of images as well that are thrown in there where we've kind of, you know, we've got definition and context across the frame. What it does is it means that the viewer can passively look. They can't predict what's coming next, so they can't fill it in. So they have to actively look at each row of images throughout that kind of grid that they're scrolling through. And there's been loads of studies on this. There's loads of theories on it. So I always think that's such a valid, interesting thing because, you know, do you want your work to be kind of passively looked at? Or do you want it to be, you know, an active looking for the viewer? Because the two are very different. And we all experience this. You know, if you go on to somebody's blog post and their signature style is that they're shooting like that with their aperture, you know, you kind of start scrolling faster towards the end because it's all very repetitive.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You know, there's lots of photographers where I've had this conversation with them and they're like, you know, they'll go and explore doing something different with their aperture. And then they'll come back to me and they'll be like, Amy, that's not for me, you know. I'm going to continue shooting 2.8 or wider because I like the look of that. And I'm like, that's fine because at least it's been, you know, 100% considered and you know that that's the way that you want it. But I've probably had equal or more photographers come back to me and and have said, actually, maybe that's where I was going wrong, you know. I actually like the look of this. And, you know, it's we've got to explore and figure out what our signature style is through just simple camera settings. It can't just be you know, let's just fall into this habitual way of doing things and not really have that consideration afterwards. Because, you know, the amount of I see thousands of raw files from photographers all over the world. And, you know, I've seen some cracking action shots where we've got like groomsmen doing the limbo or having like vodka poured into his mouth and there's like chaos happening around him, but it's been shot at like f2 and we're like, no. You know. So there's no right or wrong with this, but understanding that. And, you know, for some people they've never thought about that, you know, beyond just let's get prime lenses and shoot it like this. I was one of them, you know. It's been a process for me too.
That's really interesting, how the client views the photos or how the end customer views them. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Jumping back to the tech, obviously there's loads of camera bodies being released constantly and there's different lenses. How much of an impact does the lens and the camera have on your colouring, and what's the how does it differ between each brand? Because you talked about the Sony boom a wee while ago. So how's that? How does that change between each camera and lens?
I would say the lens differences are so small.
Yeah.
But the sensor differences on camera is the key thing, really, and it differs massively. So not only in terms of color, so we know that coloring can shift across different camera brands: Canon, Nikon, Sony, Fuji, but also, you know, just contrast levels, dynamic range is different as well. So if you're starting off, point is where we've got a whole and it obviously depends on how we're shooting that camera as well, you know, what metering mode we're shooting in terms of how much contrast we're then getting in the raw file. That all of that plays a role in that editing process, because, you know, a lot of people, for example, come to me and they'll want quite a really contemporary contrasty punch to the work, but then they're shooting in a metering mode that's ultimately flattening contrast, you know. So that's kind of working in the opposite way that photographer is wanting to work. So it's not even just in a colouring realm, it's about, you know, contrast as well, and use of light is everything as well, I guess. But yeah, very different across the camera brands in terms of colour. You know, Fuji pretty much the colours in the raw are very, very, you know, true to reality. There's literally zero going wrong with that. And I think a lot of Fuji shooters appreciate that in their kit. That's one of the things that they love, especially if they've come from like the filmic, you know, being interested in film. A lot of those people love Fuji, and it's probably for that reason as well. Yeah. Whereas, you know, Canon's a little bit true to reality, adds a bit of saturation, and then you've got Nikon and Sony that are just way off way off the spectrum in terms of what it's doing with yellows, greens. We're talking like neon out of space shit going on. So yeah, we definitely need to identify that and really control it in the preset build, because that's your only way to control it, really. But yeah,
certain brands obviously you know, have, like you said, like Sony, like how does the sensor get to be that way? Because is it intentional?
I've literally no idea. I don't know what the answer is to that. I think just in the same way that, you know, Adobe has made its own color profiles, and Capture One's doing something different with its file rendering as well, and how it's treating that information captured on the sensor. You know, these camera brands are definitely, you know, they sit there and obviously they're trying to focus on the technical, you know, getting as many megapixels in there as possible and all that. But yeah, I just think the guys at Sony were drunk one day when it came to yellow and green. Yeah. Maybe they just love that. And the thing is, you know, when it comes to like color theory, we all have preferences, you know. Some people I work with really cannot stand a neutral base of colour or a magenta base of colour. They have to work on the yellow or green side of the spectrum. And it's just in the same way that, you know, generally across styles, some of us prefer warmer images, some of us prefer cooler images, some of us just want to keep it neutral. So I think I don't know whether it's so much as a brand thing, but they've obviously sat there and done the best that they could with that. But yeah, it's just a little bit off. I don't know whether that's because we're so used to maybe what the other brands have done first or whatever. But yeah, it's just vastly different. So we need to be understanding that and controlling that. And yeah, where you would do that actually is in the calibration box in Lightroom, right at the bottom of the develop module. It used to be called camera calibration.
Oh yeah, okay.
And the amount of photographers I work with, and they're like, I've never used that, or I don't know what that is, or I avoid it, or maybe they use it as another way to just manipulate the color grading in their images or whatever. But that's where I start making presets, and it's just about identifying what camera the photographer's shooting and what needs to be corrected with how the sensor's recorded colour. It needs to be put in that box, you know. So obviously Nikon, Sony, we're on that green primary slider. We're plus 30, minus 30 on those. It's crazy. Yeah. And so there's my top tip for Sony Nikon shooters.
And obviously we are talking about colour here. Canon, Sony, Nikon, Leica, Panasonic, all these cameras have their strengths and their flaws. So we're just talking about color. So we're not Sony bashing, because, Sony are really great cameras. They have, and that goes with, Canon, and, even if they overheat, Panasonic with their IBIS, all these cameras have strengths and weaknesses. Do you find a lot of people, photographer-wise, use Panasonic for their images? And I'm only asking because I've kind of just delved into buying one for my own and documenting my kids and stuff. So I'm using the Panasonic S5. But having shot with Canon a lot, I feel like the images and the colors I'm getting from the Panasonic are actually pretty amazing. But it could, again, it could just be me.
Yeah, I mean, I've not worked with many people that shoot Panasonic. I've worked with obviously all of the main 4 brands. I've worked with lots of people that have upgraded the kit to full Leica systems. Those guys are clearly earning too much money, by the way.
I was going to say, woofed.
And then right up to, people using the Hasselblad systems as well. And I mean, we're not bashing any camera brand at all. I can talk shit about Sony because I'm a Sony shooter myself. So it's not necessarily about the actual camera. I think the most important thing there is just making sure that you get a kit that you're comfortable with, but also understanding how that kit works. I mean, the amount of photographers that I've worked with that did jump ship to Sony and aren't maximizing on the settings that make the Sony kit great, I'm like, so why aren't we doing this? And they're like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, come on. Let's just, so I think it's more about that. So ultimately it doesn't really matter what you shoot. We need to just be understanding what is happening with that file, whether anything needs to be corrected before we, go into the whole editing side of things. So if you're happy with your Panasonic colors, then that's obviously, putting you in a positive position there. Whereas
yeah, it's all about knowing how to use the file, because as you said, the images off the Sony sensor are way off color-wise, but you know what sliders to change to get them right for you. So,
Yeah, and it's not about, if anybody's listening and thinking, well, what do I change? How do I tackle that? How do I fix it? All you need to do is a simple common sense process of look at the raw file. You were there when you shot that scene, so you know exactly what it should have looked like. So it's about using the sliders in that calibration box to get it looking as realistic as possible. But don't be afraid to really move it. I think another thing that kind of throws photographers off when it does come to editing and kind of faffing on sliders is that they're kind of afraid to go too far with it a lot of the time. And I think this is probably more so when it comes to white balance. I think a lot of photographers kind of assume auto white balance is sort of right, but then we all know that for most images, we're going to be on that temperature slider. So why we assume that it is sort of right is kind of insane in itself. But we all know that we're going to nudge it a little bit. And sometimes we don't nudge it enough. So again, it's about, just having a bit more confidence in what we're doing, and not so much trusting the software to help with that, because often it doesn't help us, or the hardware, for example, with the sensors.
Well, let's get on to talking about a little bit more focus on how we should be doing stuff. Obviously, like you said, it does vary, and you need to think about all these things when you're making an image. But just quickly, getting to basics, camera settings. What profile should we be shooting in?
Ooh. It's kind of like,
Yeah.
It's style dependent, isn't it? So I mean, with the Fuji guys, there's a lot of Fuji shooters and they love shooting in classic chrome, and that gives a certain look, especially if you want in the filmic vibe. I totally get that. And with Fuji shooters, I do kind of promote that in a way. But the rest of us, we just need to be shooting completely neutral in terms of profiles. You know, don't faff around with it. When it comes into Lightroom, by default, it's going to be changed to Adobe Color, which isn't the best at all. So at that point, that's where you kind of have to go into that calibration section and really look at it and just ultimately try and get the raw file that you're seeing as realistic as possible. Get the greens looking really realistic. And like I say, it's a massive shift. You know, if you're a Sony or a Nikon shooter, you're looking at plus 30, minus 30 on those green primary sliders. Very minimal on the red and the blue. So that'll put you in a good starting position. Only at that point then should you be looking at applying a preset or doing any form of like, you know, manipulating colour or whatever, because you're starting off on a very neutral, realistic base. You're not starting off on a base that's potentially got these crazy neon as fuck greens, you know, that's going to ultimately just throw off whatever you're trying to do on the green HSL. You know, people really struggle getting like the greens that they want is a common issue. And it is down to that in you know, in the first place. So yeah, keep it completely neutral. I'd say more so important than like color profiles, because we can always kind of correct that afterwards anyway. But just make sure that you're shooting in the right metering mode and that metering mode is working for the style that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Because that is the biggest thing that a lot of people change when I'm working with photographers. So, you know, if you're somebody that feels like your work is quite flat and doesn't have as much contrast in it, and then in editing you're putting in lots of contrast, or you're manipulating the light in editing, you know, with maybe the brush or the radial filter or the graduated filters, then the metering mode you're shooting in is not working in the same way that you are trying to use light as a photographer.
Yeah.
So understand that first, you know. For most photographers, from kind of anybody that isn't the light and airy realm, you know, we should be in either spot metering or any metering mode that's kind of like that or better. So like I shoot Sony, so I'm in highlights metering mode, but that's not available to any other camera user. Canon don't have that. Nikon don't have that. So yeah, figure out what the metering mode is on your cameras, what's available to you, shoot in it, experiment with them, figure out what's giving you the best results that you want in terms of the raw image before you start editing it. Because that's the key thing. That's where everybody kind of goes a little bit wrong.
Should photographers be choosing the metering mode based on the style that they're aiming to deliver, or should they change it throughout the day depending on the lighting situation?
Oh, it depends on the photographer. So if you're somebody that's worked with me, what we do is I, for the most part, would say to most people to keep in that kind of spot metering realm, because in your custom preset set, you will have a preset that's going to pull back shadows in a backlit scenario if we've gone for highlights. But for other photographers, it entirely depends. They might feel really uncomfortable shooting in spot metering for certain parts of the day. Maybe it's a ceremony situation where we've got behind the couple, where we're stood as a primary shooter. Behind the couple, there might be a big window letting in loads of light. Well, spot metering is not going to be easy, you know. In that scenario, we're going to need to use exposure compensation. So for some photographers, they're like, you know, if that's the first time that they've been thinking about metering modes of what they're doing there, then that's going to be really tricky for them to do. So for those guys, I just say, you know, we'll stay in the average metering mode. So depending on what you're shooting, it does change its name. So Canon, it's evaluative, Nikon matrix, Sony multi, Fuji average. For those guys, it's about switching back to that metering mode to gain more control in trickier scenarios. So it depends on the photographer and what that photographer feels comfortable with. I'm just really lazy. I feel like my camera's like point and shoot. Like I don't even care if it's half black when I'm looking. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I understand the magic in editing.
Yeah. Oh, it's actually really funny being filmmakers and working alongside some photographers that, try and try to kind of retain as much information in the highlights, so they shoot really dark, and then the couple will be like, oh, can we see them? And then they're having to like show them the screen, and I've seen some horrific faces of couples being like, I can't even see anything, Jeff, I can't even see this image. Shocking. And the photographer is obviously just having to kind of like explain the tech and how he has to shoot darker. It's quite a funny thing. But like I said, as filmmakers, one thing that we have to do all the time is, well, we don't have to do, but a big thing for us is to select our chosen white balance, especially if there's like a scene that's more documentary. So there's maybe 2 or 3 camera angles. You don't want each camera guessing what white balance is in a particular room, because then you'll have to spend hours in post correcting that. So for photographers out there, how should they set their white balance?
Avoid auto white balance at all costs.
I was hoping you'd say that. Okay.
100%. So it's actually the only thing on my whole program that I actually bully people into. I'm like, you've signed up to this. If you do not do this, you will not get the end results that you're looking for. It's that simple. I'm a massive advocate of shooting a manual Kelvin. It's a little bit of a hurdle for some photographers, especially if you're reliant on what it looks like on the back of the camera. So I just talk about shooting one temperature. Everything is shot at the same temperature, so that when we come into post-production, we can batch edit each section of the day. So not only is it mega quick, but also the consistency that you get with that is massive. Auto white balance has never helped anybody, let's be honest. The amount of time wasted on that temperature slider. And auto white balance, it's built to balance and neutralize light all the time. And in a lot of scenarios, we don't want that as a photographer. If we're shooting golden hour, how often do we shoot that? And if we've shot it in auto white balance, it looks a lot less golden. But then we're like, it's fine. We're going to warm it up afterwards anyway, It's just crazy. But also it really fucks with skin tones and all sorts of stuff that just makes editing hard.
So for our listeners out there who do struggle with the idea of like setting your manual white balance, how do they do that? Is it okay to just keep with the sun logo on their dial?
Right. Well, no. So one of the things that Lightroom does really bad is it has within the algorithm where it's kind of rendering that image that we then see on screen, it's questioning whether it wants to change the color balance of an image, and where it does that is actually on the tint slider. So it's completely unrelated to any form of, say, manual tint that you could put in camera settings. So you would assume that if, you decided to put your white balance and shift it to mega pink, that on import it would show those kind of, that we put it towards the pink side of things on that tint slider, because it's teamed with the temperature slider. So you assume that's the 4 squares that we have control over in camera, but it absolutely isn't. It's completely unrelated to camera and what we put in there. That's where it's basically manipulating the color balance on import. So it's changing. If we've, say, got a green scene, and often, a lot of us will shoot in a green scene, we'll put our couple amongst some trees on green grass, whatever, often, if you look at any of your images in Lightroom, raw files of that type of scene, you will always see that tint slider on the pink side. And it's because it's identified, there's loads of green in this image, we're going to stick a bit of pink in there. So it's tried to manipulate that and neutralise it a little bit. Obviously, we understand it's very greensy because that's where we've shot, that's the location. But yeah, because it does that, it often gets it wrong. Now, I've seen files where that tint slider is up at like the plus 50, plus 70, and it's caused a real colour cast on the file. And you can be looking at an image going, that looks really pink, but obviously that's wrong. That's not what it looks like when I was there shooting it. Yeah. And it's because of this import algorithm that's just totally bananas. So because of that, I only recommend shooting in the manual Kelvin, the K symbol. I don't recommend shooting in any of the program modes, whether it's cloudy, shady, sunny, whatever. And the reason for that is because if you shoot in the Kelvin, it completely eradicates this issue with Lightroom. It just completely tricks that import algorithm and it stops it doing anything. So when you shoot the manual Kelvin, every single file you import that's shot at the same temperature will show as the exact same point on that tint slider. So it'll become a redundant issue. You won't have files that have potentially got colour casts on them on either the green or the magenta side of things. So it is for that reason that I only recommend the K shooting the manual Kelvin over one of the other ones. But the Kelvin that you shoot at is, again, it's style dependent. I personally shoot everything at 5,500. 5,560 is daylight, but some Canon users can't set the 5560. So I switched to 5,500 because that's camera universal. Everybody can set that. And obviously, if you're going to adopt this method of shooting, it's imperative that you get your second shooters to do the same, because there's nothing worse than you shooting the Kelvin and then your second shooter shooting auto white balance. That is the worst. So that would just totally waste all the time you've saved by having your sort of set colour. Yeah, exactly. And it's never going to be right. This isn't about getting it right in camera in terms of the temperature. This is just simply about recording everything as one colour, one temperature, so that we can then correct it afterwards. And one of the things that I teach on my program is how to control white balance using the histogram. So it's actually something solid to go off, and it'll tell you whether you're right or wrong in where you put that temperature slider. Whereas I think a lot of photographers really struggle with white balance control, because ultimately most people are kind of just eyeballing it, just kind of moving that slider to where it looks right on that image. And what you end up as an end result when you've got that way of working is your images go from being cool to warm to neutral to cool to warm to neutral. It's just kind of all over the place, really inconsistent. Whereas when we record everything as one temperature and we can batch correct the temperature, the white balance afterwards, so like all bridal prep is one temperature, one correction afterwards, every single bridal prep image will look exactly the same in terms of like your colour tonality, skin tones, the walls, everything will look exactly the same. So the consistency is off the scale, and there's lots of photographers doing this, but it's not the easiest to hurdle to jump, I think. I mean, you guys are used to it, but some photographers, especially for EVF, they worry about, guests and clients seeing the back of the screen. If it's if we're indoors and we're shooting 5,500 and it's ambient, I mean, it's orange as fuck, and that puts people off. They're like, God, I can't do this. But we've just got to have conviction and confidence in there, just say, like, what look like that afterwards, it's fine.
When you're using these cameras for creating films, it's so much more critical to get it dialed in per scene and per lighting situation, because there's not as much latitude. And we're so jealous of the post-production flexibility that the raw files have for photography.
So jealous of photographers shooting raw. Oh my goodness, honestly.
I don't envy you guys at all.
How can people out there get you to work on their presets?
Send me a DM.
And where's the best place?
Slide into those DMs on Instagram,
Okay.
or you can just go to my website, which is northernpresets.co.uk.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really shit name, isn't it? It's because the first thing everybody says when I'm on a video call with them is, "You're so northern."
Oh, that's amazing. You're not northern to us.
Yeah. You guys have accents. I love it.
Well, Amy-Leigh, thank you very much for taking even longer than we had asked for to be with us. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Where can people find you online?
Instagram, DM, Northern Presets Co. or northernpresets.co.uk. Send me an email.
And yes, hopefully, if you join us tomorrow, you'll get a cool new announcement.
Yes, definitely, 100%.
I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, it's worth it. It's worth the wait, the 24-hour wait, guys.
Yes. And you can find us at cinematefilms.co.uk. Our Instagram and Facebook is /cinematefilms. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/perspective by Cinemate. For as little as £1, you can support us creating this awesome podcast. And for the price of a coffee every month, you can get access to all the Q&As, our Clubhouse discussions, and even more content that won't be available anywhere else. If you don't have any money to give us just now, that's absolutely fine. You are still our best friends. You can just hit that subscribe button and you'll get notified as to when the new episodes of the podcast are released. If we could just get you to leave a review, we'll give you a shout out. That's cool. However,
In the meantime,
enjoy your life